Well, they've been extensive, as you say. It's definitely the most sanctioned country in the world, but it's also the most integrated into the kind of international supply chain, particularly Europe. And so closing down that supply chain is very challenging. And it also presents Europeans with challenges, which is how much do we want to hurt our own economy in trying to bring the Russian economy to heel?
So, at the time, you were getting the sense that countries like Germany, European countries, were going to try and wean themselves off of the oil and the gas that Russia provides. Have they not been successful?
No, I think they've made a lot more progress than certainly I thought they were going to. And I do think we need to remember ultimately what is our objective here with these sanctions. It's less to bankrupt the Russian economy, and it's more to prevent the Russian military getting the components that they need in order to build the missiles and the drones that tragically rain down on Ukraine every day. And that's, I think, where these loopholes and these circumvention mechanisms that you mentioned really are a problem.
So give us a sense how they've used those loopholes and how they have gained access to what they need to continue this war, which has just become a war of attrition.
Yeah, there are two parts to this. So the first thing is that if I am a manufacturer sitting in France, Germany, the UK, indeed Australia, it is not illegal for me to export kit to Kazakhstan, to the UAE, to Turkey. And it's not really illegal for the Turks or the Emiratis to then export that on to Russia. So you've got this kind of dogleg circumvention mechanism. But the second thing is that our manufacturers need to get smart. And if they see a tremendous increase in sales to Kazakhstan or the UAE, they need to stop and ask themselves for a second, why is that happening? Am I part of a circumvention mechanism? And should I actually be desisting from increasing sales rather than embracing that?
Yeah, and so often, to your point, countries want to be appearing to be doing the right thing, but then happily go along with those loopholes.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've had meetings in European capitals where people have leant forward very earnestly, Bev, and said, Tom, you've got to understand that we have a very important manufacturing sector in the south of Germany, as an example, and we need to be careful not to damage that. And this is at a time when politics in Europe in particular is quite fractious. You don't want to be destroying your economy at the point when you're asking electors to vote for you. So I think Europe does face quite some challenges in squeezing Russia to the extent we need to squeeze Russia without damaging its own economy. That's clearly an unacceptable position as far as Ukrainians are concerned, and indeed as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, because it's kind of taking money on one hand and then having to give it back on the other. It would be quicker to end it in a different way. I mean, China, India, North Korea, there are plenty of countries that are still prepared to do business with Russia, and of course they are the world's second biggest oil supplier.
Yeah, I spent the day in Brussels earlier this week, and a lot of people said that, we're trying to cut down supply chains, but whether it's China or India or North Korea, as you say, what can we do? And I think what we can do is make sure that we are doing what we possibly can do, on the one hand, to implement sanctions, but also to engage these countries in a diplomatic discussion. Is it really appropriate for a country to invade illegally an innocent neighbor? Is that something that you really want to support? So I think diplomacy is going to be very important in all of this, to make sure that these countries realize that at some point you have to choose sides. And in this case, it's pretty obvious which side you should be choosing.
Yeah. I've also read, Tom, about businesses that very publicly exited Russia because of this conflict, but were actually almost held to ransom and subjected to high penalties to get out of Russia.
Yeah, this is one thing I think that we often forget, which is, of course, Russia has agency. Russia does not sit there and go, oh, okay, the sanctions are on me. I'm sorry, I'll change my way of dealing. And of course, they can fight back. And so if you're a company that hung around in Russia after February 2022, then you're finding you're being taxed heavily. Your ability to exit the country is being more and more difficult, nigh on impossible. And you are now funding Russia's war in Ukraine. And you made a mistake back in February 2022. So the Russians are definitely fighting back in what is essentially an economic war. And I think often in Europe, certainly, we don't appreciate that we are at economic war with Russia. And that should be, if you like, our motif when we decide how we should operate with sanctions.
Yeah, such a good point. Is this, Russia is still being impacted. They're selling oil cheaply, but still selling oil. How would you characterize how resilient the economy is and what impact it's had on life for Russians?
If I was the governor of the Central Bank of Russia, I would be very concerned because they're basically sitting on an economic time bomb. Inflation is rising rapidly. People often say, oh, the Russian economy is growing faster than the European economy and so on. Well, it is if what you think economic growth is producing trucks and tanks and then them being destroyed 2 weeks later in Ukraine. So I think there's as people say, there are lies, damn lies, and statistics, and I can tell you that the Russian statistics are the epitome of lies. So the economy is clearly suffering. For everyday Russians, they can't get access to things that perhaps were important to them, online services and products. So I think the economy is being squeezed. But as David O'Sullivan, who is the EU's sanctions envoy, is fond of saying, sanctions are a slow puncture. They're not a switch that is going to turn an economy out overnight. And we need to be patient and persistent to let that slow puncture work its way through until the tire is completely flat.
Yeah, let's hope it's running out of air very quickly. Tom, really great to get your analysis and help us make sense of it all. Good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth.